Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Berkeley Boosts. My name is Jim Gilbert, and I'm the Director of Executive Education at Berkeley Law. It's wonderful to have you with us today. We're very excited today to have the first in a three-part series of webinars on whistleblowing and whistleblowers. Before we begin our presentation, I want to mention that for those of you in the audience who would like to earn MCLE credit for this webinar, we'd ask that you please fill out the form that you can reach at the URL on the screen, tinyurl.com/bb-whistleblower1. You'll find that link in the chat as well. At the conclusion of the webinar, we'll be sending out a certificate of attendance for your records. Berkeley Boosts is just one part of the larger Berkeley Law Executive Education program. I'd like to take a few moments to tell you about some of our upcoming events and programs. The first of which is Sustainable Capitalism and ESG Online. This is a course that opens on May 11th and demonstrates how to integrate environmental, social, and government considerations into business strategy. Next up are executive summer courses. These are programs for practicing attorneys that are offered from mid-May to mid-August through our professional LLM program. Attorneys have the opportunity to take courses in a variety of different subjects, taught by Berkeley Law faculty, and again, along with our LLM students. Then we have our General Counsel Institute. This is a program for in-house attorneys, and this year, we're going beyond legal by bringing together a wide range of executives from the C-suite and beyond to discuss how they work with and are impacted by in-house legal professionals. That program will take place over 4 half days in June. And then I want to mention some other upcoming Berkeley Boost webinars. I mentioned this is a three-part series. First part is today on whistleblowing. Part 2 will take place tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific. And the third and concluding part of that series will take place on Monday morning, 10 a.m. Pacific time. And finally, we close out the month with our webinar on women in law, policy, and government. You can learn about all of these programs at executive.law.berkeley.edu. Now, this webinar that's going to take place today is a three-part series that's looking at whistleblowing, whistleblower laws, and the impacts they have had on fraud enforcement over the past 35 years. Today's topic is what motivates individual whistleblowers to speak up and the risks that they face when they do. The format of this presentation today will be a panel discussion with our participants, followed by a short Q&A. If you're interested in submitting questions, please use the Q&A button that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Submit the questions and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. Today's moderator is Erika Kelton. Erika is a partner at Phillips Cohen. She's an internationally recognized whistleblower lawyer, and just as important, she's a Berkeley Law alum. So with that, I'll turn it over to Erika.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you all for attending, speaking up. As Jim mentioned, tomorrow and on Monday, we'll be discussing the laws that give whistleblowers a unique position in civil fraud enforcement in the United States. But for today, we're going to be focusing on the whistleblowers themselves. Learn their stories, learn what motivates them to speak up, and learn what they experience when they do. I'm joined by Maria Guzman from Florida. John Banerjee is joining us from London, and Tom Mueller is joining from Italy. Thank you all. Tom Mueller is an American writer living in Liguria, Italy. You've probably seen his work in the New Yorker, New York Times Magazine, and National Geographic. His work covers a broad range of topics, everything from how computers are changing the game of chess, to 40,000-year-old mammoths, to Brunelleschi's Rome. His book, Extra Virginity, or his books include Extra Virginity, The Sublime and Scandalous World of Olive Oil, and of course, Crisis of Conscience, Whistleblowing in an Age of Fraud. In Crisis of Conscience, Tom takes a deep dive look into whistleblowers and the rise of whistleblowing over the past few decades. In the course of writing and investigating the book, Tom spoke to over 200 whistleblowers. His book explores what motivates some people to speak up when others don't, and what whistleblowers can suffer when they do. For anyone interested in the subject of whistleblowers and whistleblowing, this book is a must. Maria Guzman, in January 2012, Mia was hired as a sales representative at a pharma company, Insys Therapeutics. Insys made a single drug, Subsys, a powerful fentanyl drug that is 80 to 100 times stronger than morphine and highly addictive. The FDA approved Subsys only for breakthrough cancer pain, just a single indication. But Insys pushed doctors to write for any kind of pain and at very high doses, notwithstanding the addictive qualities of the drug. Insys drove the sales of Subsys as well through massive kickback scheme. They paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to physicians in quid pro quo for prescriptions. Mia objected to the practices and especially the terrible impact on patients that she saw. About a year and a half after being hired, she was fired. Shortly after that, she filed a whistleblower lawsuit under the Federal False Claims Act, which you'll be hearing more about tomorrow. There was a parallel criminal investigation launched as well. The impact of her whistleblowing and her whistleblower lawsuit is huge. In 2019, 7 former execs and sales officers at Insys, including the former CEO and founder of the company, John Kapoor, were convicted criminally. Over a dozen physicians now have also been convicted. And Insys Therapeutics in June of 2019 agreed to pay the Justice Department to settle both the civil and criminal liability, including Mia's whistleblower suit. They agreed to pay $225 million. But a few days after that settlement was announced, Insys declared bankruptcy. And of the $225 million, the government has been paid only $35 million, and the rest remains being disputed in bankruptcy court. John is a former head trader of emerging markets, FX, in the Royal Bank of Canada office in London. He was hired in 2015 to head that desk, and a little over a year later, he was fired after he raised concerns about RBC's compliance culture. What happened is that employees like John were obligated to certify annually that they'd read the compliance policies. Instead of just scrolling to the end of the certification and ticking the box, John actually read them, or he tried to. What he found over the next 48 hours is a multitude of problems: broken links, internal inconsistencies, inaccessible sections. So he didn't check the box. Instead, he wrote to compliance and flagged this for them. And he explained why he couldn't in good faith certify, because it was really impossible to certify that he'd read the compliance policies. It's really important to note that 79,000 other RBC employees did scroll down and tick the box, even though it was impossible to comply. John kept raising his concerns over the next few months. After all, RBC had made a point of telling the employees that they could escalate concerns and that they were encouraged to do so. The bank said that they investigated John's concerns, and then they concluded that there was nothing to indicate that RBC had a box-ticking, non-compliant culture. At the same time that they launched that internal investigation, they also secretly investigated John, looking for rule violations. They found none, and in fact, he had been given an excellent performance evaluation shortly before. But notwithstanding that, 2 months later, John was sacked and escorted out of the building. The reason the bank posed was that he engaged in poor timekeeping, a reason that was later found to be pretextual. John challenged the unfair dismissal in the UK's employment tribunal, where only 3% of whistleblowers succeed. But in this David versus Goliath story, John represented himself, and RBC later claimed that it had a team of 37 people on the defense, sometimes working weekends. In 2018, John won the liability case, and the tribunal indicated the costs and damages were approximately 1.4 million pounds. But the last 2.5 years have been spent litigating that remedy. So 5 years after being fired, he hasn't seen a penny, and he's been rendered unemployable. So panelists, thank you again. Tom, I'd like to start with you. You spoke to 200 whistleblowers in the course of writing your book. What were the common threads from all these whistleblower stories?
Thank you, Erika, and it's an honor to be here. Most scholarship on whistleblowers stresses that there is no one whistleblower gene, one whistleblower personality or character. But in the course of my numerous interviews, I did run into some common themes, and they were a combination of timing plus character. The timing seemed to be the sweet spot for people who blew the whistle was senior enough to be confident in their own professional knowledge, not to be swallowing the line that their boss or boss's boss is telling them is the way to do things, but not so senior that they're getting paid in massive stock options and they've swallowed the mentality of the firm so far that they don't question it anymore. And so often the phrase, "I was just doing my job," comes up, and I would suspect that with Mia and John, the same thing applies. Part of the job is to make sure that the company doesn't run aground on bad behavior, and that's what they did. And so many whistleblowers do that. But character, again, there's no one whistleblower gene, but my experience shows that there are, there's a certain white and black, right and wrong approach to ethical questions. I mean, they're deontologists or virtue ethicists. They're not utilitarians. Some things are right and some things are wrong, period, which can be a kind of conservative and old-fashioned, a sense of fairness, a sense of honesty. They typically are rules people. In fact, one nuclear engineer whistleblower said, "I'm a rules kind of gal." And sure enough, they have manuals to follow and they follow the rules. This can be perceived by their coworkers as sort of prickly or nonconformist. They're not typically the best team players or go along to get along types. They're certainly not the good soldiers who are going to do whatever it takes to execute the assignment. They may not be the life of the party, but that's exactly why they're able to break away from the incredible force field that an organization, and not just a corporation, but also a university, an NGO, a government agency, exerts on people. And they're able to stand up to authority. Not necessarily rebels, but they're not willing to say a lie to protect their boss. It's a combination of timing. Several people said, if I had found this out 3 years earlier or 3 years later, I might not have blown the whistle. So it's a sort of a sweet spot in time, but you have to be predisposed to stand up.
Yeah. I'm wondering, Tom, in your travels in writing this book, did anything really surprise you? Were any of your assumptions going in challenged or really changed?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the nature of the organization, whether, again, that be the National Security Agency or Harvard University or a big bank or a big pharmaceutical company, there's a remarkable commonality in the kind of visceral, vicious retaliation that organizations exert on whistleblowers or people who question them. And it's incredible to see. That's almost a playbook that's played out every time a whistleblower steps up. It's almost an own goal, because in many cases, they would be much better served to listen to what the whistleblower has to say and deal with it. but they've taken it so personally, and the reaction is so visceral. It's almost like an immune response to a foreign body or something. I mean, they're so violent in their reaction to it that it often causes a whistleblower situation to go nuclear. And so many whistleblowers, this theory that they're trying to harm their organization is complete bunk in my experience. I mean, they are actually trying to help the organization to avoid horrible bad press and illegal behavior and so on. And quite often, almost invariably, they surface their concerns within the organization first. And they go through the chain of command. They go to their boss's boss, to compliance, to legal, to everyone who will listen, to the CEO, everyone who will listen. And then only when they get the pink slip, only when they're fired, do they even think about becoming an outside whistleblower. So they have a sense of higher loyalty to the firm, which I think is overlooked in many cases when people talk about disgruntled employees and, they had it in for their boss. That's, in my experience, simply part of the whistleblower retaliation playbook that organizations go through almost without knowing it. I'm not sure that there's a printed retaliation playbook, although there may well be, but the way in which it's consistently applied across human organizations is alarming, but also enlightening.
Yeah. Well, we'll certainly be talking more about retaliation and those reactions throughout this panel. But, I also, in my career, I've had the same experience where an institution's reaction, in some sense, makes it worse. And certainly in the United States, where there are whistleblower programs, the reaction, not taking a whistleblower's concern seriously, does often drive individuals to become whistleblowers within the whistleblower law structure. John and Mia, the $1 million question that I'm sure everybody is dying to hear the answer to. Why did you guys do it? John, let's start with you.
Actually, it was very simple. I had both legal and regulatory obligations to do what I did. So what Tom was saying about being a rules-based guy, let's put this all into context. I worked in banking, and banks had been fined tens and tens of billions of dollars since the global financial crisis for wrongdoing. Banks have a special place in any economy. They're the only entity that can create money, for instance. And in exchange for that, the public expects banks to be regulated and to perform to those regulations. In essence, I was just doing my job. I was pointing out that we were doing a number of things that were totally contrary to our regulatory and legal obligations. That's how it started. And incidentally, if I hadn't done those things, if those regulatory and legal obligations were actually enforced against me, I could have found myself unemployable for not escalating the concerns.
Yeah, difficult position. How about you, Mia? Why did you do it? You're a mute, Mia. So.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
For me, I would say I would see firsthand the callousness and the greed that the patients were being treated with. I would walk into the waiting rooms, I would see the families and the patients, and the physicians had no concern. They looked at these patients as garbage, just addicts that were there just to serve a profit margin for this physician, for the executives. And, my background, my mother passed away when I was a teenager due to medical malpractice. So I actually saw myself in those patients. And it was really hard to go to sleep at night and knowing this, because if you don't know, if you've never walked in that if you've never been in that position, you don't know, and you just look at them as addicts. So with that in mind, and then I would be remiss if I didn't mention my husband is a veteran. And so for him, you serve despite personal cost. And if I had met him later, I might not, I wanted to, say that Tom is right. If I had met my husband later, I might not have stepped out and said anything, but his influence, where you do the right thing, whether there's a personal sacrifice, it might mean that you might be disabled, for example, like a veteran would, or a military person would do. And so I guess that gave me a little bit of the courage that you need to stand up for what's right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's powerful, very powerful. I'm wondering also, both Mia and John, and starting with you, Mia, were you prepared, either emotionally or financially, for what was to happen? And did you anticipate the reaction and blowback from your whistleblowing?
Well, certainly I didn't. I mean, I thought all I was doing was just complying with my obligations. In fact, I responded in particular to a presentation that was entitled "Don't Ask, Don't Tell, Won't Be Tolerated." There was a new piece of legislation which was incorporated in the UK, whereby senior managers would be held to account for the serious wrongdoing in the divisions which they controlled, including they could get 7 years bonus clawback. So the idea of accountability was the UK regulatory reaction to the global financial crisis. It only got enacted in 2016, but I thought that this was all genuine on the part of the senior managers. Actually, I now know, having more than 100 whistleblowers from RBC came forward after I won to an entity called Whistleblowers UK. And anyhow, I now know that it would appear that anybody who raises concerns is likely to get drummed out the firm. The practice was pretty much inverse to the policy. But anyhow, the point is that I had no clue what was about to happen to me at all. I was extremely naive. I'd only reported it internally, openly, to the head of division and set out exactly what my concerns were with examples. And I was thanked for it. And meanwhile, in actual fact, little did I know that the wheels, the mail was sent to the head of contentious exits in less than an hour. So no, I was just completely naive and ignorant to it.
How about you, Mia? Were you prepared at all?
No, I was absolutely unprepared. I had no idea how, first of all, you don't even know that there was going to even be a criminal trial being pursued parallel to the civil trial. So that created a whole extra layer of complication for my case and for me. Did you ask Erika about the types of steps they took to retaliate, or just how
well, why don't we move on to that? I mean, how has being a whistleblower followed you, particularly in your employment? What about the difficulty of finding another position after you guys were terminated?
So for me, since I was in pharma sales, I was blacklisted and I could not find a job to save my life in pharma. But I had no idea that I was even being blacklisted because the case was under seal. And so I would apply to these jobs. I would go through the interview process and get to the final stage where I was told that I was basically had the job. Can I provide references? And then they would just never call me back. And I never connected it in the beginning. It took a while. I did not connect it to the case at all. And as time progressed, then I started, connecting the timing and whatnot. And so I no longer ever plan to work in pharma again, but that is a cost to speaking out. There is a career cost in that, and you have to find a way to reinvent yourself and redefine your goals in life. And so there was more odd things that happened where my phone was hacked multiple times, my computer was hacked. I can't say where that came from. I can only say those were the kind of things that I was experiencing. My car windshield was broken. My home was broken into. A person came to my door and asked me if I didn't agree public speaking was scary. Very odd things. I was even run off the road twice, and I just thought it was crazy teenagers. So even while that type of odd behavior was happening, I didn't connect it to the case, because who would do something like that? And so it's something that maybe, if I had known that would happen, I don't even think it would change the choice I made, though. I think that's their intention, but it kind of just makes you become more stubborn and say, you're not going to get away with this.
Yeah.
It's odd.
Yeah. Some of the traits of whistleblowers that Tom was referring to there. How about for you, John? What's been your path since you were sacked?
So I was sort of publicly told that my concerns were going to be investigated, and I was interviewed more than once by the head of internal audit, I now know, in fact, in the judgment, the main concern that I'd raised, the most important one, had not been investigated at all on the instructions of the CEO. So the head of internal audit, who's the man who's ultimately responsible for making sure that we complied with our legal and regulatory obligations, wasn't acting independently. He was told by the CEO not to investigate the main issue because there was a route of investigation that I pointed out that would have demonstrated that, I say, I have factual evidence that no one could have complied, including the compliance officers. And the upshot of that would have been pretty, if they just dealt with it, as Tom said, it would have been great. I thought that's what they were going to do. They didn't. Instead, and something that I found from many, many whistleblowers, and my former employer isn't unique in this. In essence, whistleblower story is always the same. That they raise concerns because they want something to be rectified. The entity, whether it's private or public, focuses all of its resources on exterminating the whistleblower and not dealing with the underlying issue. Repeat, in essence. It's catastrophic, really, and leads to suboptimal outcomes, I'd say, for the entity as well as the public, actually. But maybe we'll come on to that.
Yeah. Have you been able to find other work?
No, I mean, so Finally, the employer also recognizes that during the litigation, there is no chance, no realistic prospect. Headhunters have told me that I will not be touched by a barge pole by any financial institution. I was advised to go and look at very different things altogether, like teaching or something, which incidentally I wouldn't be very very good at. But anyhow, I'm certainly not suited to. But there's no chance. And I would say to any potential employer out there that if you want to demonstrate not just that you have a policy of a speak up culture, but if you actually genuinely want to demonstrate that you encourage it because you think it's valuable to get early warning of problems, why not hire a whistleblower? Maybe, in a compliance function or something like that, and trumpet the fact that you've got a known whistleblower rather than we don't touch whistleblowers with a barge pole. Of course, it would only be an employer that actually intended to be honest and obey regulations and so on that would do that.
I've often wondered that myself too. I've represented whistleblowers for many years now, and in all those years and all those dozens and dozens of cases, there's only been one instance where a client of the firm has been hired for a compliance function. Most everyone else has either taken a different path or done something different, but not going into compliance. They could be a significant resource for companies. Tom, I think that you were about to say something and I cut you off, and I apologize for that.
No, I've seen this again and again and again. And for me, one of the most disturbing aspects of the whole whistleblowing dynamic is the blackballing culture that happens after. And society fundamentally allows this to happen. I mean, we're sitting by and watching, it's not a movie where it ends happily ever after 2 hours. These people's lives have been derailed, at least professionally, unless they can reinvent themselves. And that, for me, is the ultimate indictment of our organizational culture, but also our society that's willing to accept this kind of stuff. I mean, we put loyalty and obedience over truth and justice every single time. What is wrong here?
Yeah.
And I think that, that beyond getting stronger whistleblower regulations, and again, I mean, in the UK, for instance, any resistance to bounties, to payments, seems to me completely wrongheaded, because those aren't winning the lottery. Those are a very feeble payment for your lost career, which will never equal what you have lost in terms of ongoing income, benefits, health insurance, and all the other things that you lose. But fundamentally, yeah, I mean, I am in awe of people who can stand up and continue to do this, because it does turn your world inside out, doesn't it? I mean, not only do you do the right thing and then get punished for it, but you take an organization you think basically wants justice, and you find out it's a conspiracy against you. They're running you off the road. They're breaking into your apartment. Somebody is. What a coincidence. Or they're telling you one thing, and then an hour later, their contentious termination proceedings start. It's sinister.
Yeah, I'm struck by how this resistance towards whistleblowers isn't just isolated within corporate culture companies. And while in the US, fraud enforcement agencies and regulators have made great strides to developing a pro-whistleblower culture within their organizations, I'm reminded now on Bernie Madoff's death that that $65 billion Ponzi scheme had about 6 whistleblowers going to the SEC, separate whistleblowers, over a period of 10 years, telling the SEC, look at this can't be real. This is a Ponzi scheme, do something. And they did nothing. And when one particularly tenacious whistleblower, Harry Markopoulos, who had gone several times, persisted, and then seemed to be getting some traction, then asked about an award, and it all completely shut down. There was just this institutional resistance at that time. Now, we'll hear later how much progress the SEC has made and how powerful their whistleblower program is. That's coming on Monday. But there is this tendency, I think, among any kind of institution, public or private, to resist what whistleblowers are saying. Another thing that fascinates me, and this is a question for everybody on the panel, and Tom, I'd like to start with you, which is, in virtually every case, there are a lot of people who know about the misconduct or the fraud. In Mia's case, everybody in the company knew about it because this was Insys's business strategy. It was a strategy of fraud. In John's case, there were 79,000 other employees who knew that they weren't really complying. They were just scrolling down and ticking the box. And so why is that? Why, Tom, starting with you, why do you think some people speak up and others don't? Or so few people are speaking up?
Well, I was struck with something that Mia said about her mother and her husband being a veteran. One of the things that I noticed again and again was someone was able to speak up when they recognized a victim, when they saw clearly that someone was being harmed. This particularly happens in the medical field, but it can happen in other fields, many other fields as well. And they often say, looking at me, they would say, "What if this was your mother that was happening to? What if this was your brother who was getting this unnecessary surgery and was paralyzed from the waist down?" They were able to see the victim and put themselves into the condition of thinking, this is family. We're all family here. So there is a certain kind of wiring, but also a certain kind of personal experience that prepares you for it. And just the ability, the independence and backbone to stand up and say, I'm not going to follow the orders of my boss, which are illegal orders. I'm not going to, go along with the crowd, my peers. There's a certain independence. There's also a certain, innocence or clarity of thought, however you want to put it, naivete, if you wish. The real culture for them is what's printed in the compliance manual. This is what you're going to do. This is how we want to behave. This is the kind of company we are and what we believe in. Now, that's what's printed, but then there's the whisper culture in the background and what the CEO does on weekends that sort of signals to people who want to hear that, oh, well, actually, that's all sort of boilerplate. What we're really about is pushing fentanyl on people who can't defend themselves. But of course, they don't print that in their annual reports. It's just there. And most people are like, yeah, well, got to live in the real world. There's a certain idealism too. People who want to live in a better world and to say, this is a good company. We're trying to do the right thing, and I'm going to be a part of that. To punish people for that kind of behavior seems to me horribly wrongheaded.
Yeah, very backwards. How about you, John and Mia? Do you have further thoughts about why some people speak up and others don't, even though everybody is seeing the same thing?
Yes, certainly. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
No, go ahead.
Okay, well, I think that there are certainly there are negative consequences to speaking up that are probably more widely appreciated. But in reality, lots of people are perfectly happy just doing their own thing and will only look to one space to the left or the right and whatever's going on around them, as long as they're within the ambit of that sort of behavior, everything's fine. So the fact that everyone just clicks the boxes as in their at a station, let's say like an iOS upgrade, it was explained to me, I was asked, what on earth are you doing? You're given 30 minutes credit for going through the whole compliance process. The reason why they make you reread everything every year, or say that you've read all the policies, you have conformed and you will conform for the next year, is because, of course, these policies might change, and they do over the years. So refreshing them. You can't conform to something if you haven't read it, is my view. So simple, read it. And people are coming up to me saying, yeah, what are you doing? Why are you there so late at night reading when everyone's leaving? What is it that you're doing? It took me 2 days to read all the stuff that I could read that was available. And they described it as, look, it's just like an iOS upgrade on your phone. You can either keep your phone as a phone or turn it into a brick. What do you want to do? I mean, if you say you're not complying, you're going to lose your job. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous. Surely not. Anyway, the upshot is that with a phone, obviously, whatever the contract says, it doesn't really make any difference. If it was really onerous and bad for you, it would be unenforceable and there would be class action or something. It's not without any real consequence. But if you're in a regulated position and you're saying that, yes, I have conformed to all these things and I will conform, well, if you don't know that you can conform, for instance, if it's impossible to conform because the policy itself is self-inconsistent, you've got to be 57 varieties of stupid to sign up to that. And I think in terms of the conformity, there is, in actual fact, I was an outlier in feeling, I was a stupid person for thinking that the vast majority were foolish in not living to their obligations. Mostly people get by doing exactly what everyone else is doing. And companies might say, we want diversity, we want diversity in terms of the skin color or sexual orientation or whatever. Actually, mostly this is a nonsense. It's cover for not wanting any sort of diversity of thought. If you express any diversity of thought, it's likely to cost you in many organizations.
Yeah. How about you, Mia? You were about to say something. Why do you think that so few people speak up?
Well, with Insys, for example, there was such a corporate culture of intimidation that, and their business strategy was to hire sales reps that had no experience. And so they had no idea that they were even breaking any sort of rules or doing anything wrong. And they specifically would even target physicians or prescribers that were vulnerable as well, that were in bad financial situations, or because they knew that those prescribers would be easier to manipulate. And so part of the reason that I might have been, it just was my unique background that led me to speak up. But they also specifically created a corporate culture where speaking up would mean the end of your job. For example, they would fire the bottom 20% of the sales staff every quarter. So if you didn't produce your numbers, that every quarter, 20% of the sales staff was eliminated. So we had 10 people on my sales team in the Southeast region. Every quarter, 2 of those team members would be fired. So it was a matter of, oh my God, you didn't worry about whether you were breaking the law. You were more worried about logging your calls and submitting, histories and whatnot. So they know, at least in the Insys if you take Insys like a case study, they really knew what they were doing. And it also, I think you have to have almost like a leadership mindset where not everybody is cut out to be a leader. You can develop a leader, but somebody who can stand up and go against the grain, that's not common in my opinion. Most people want to do their job. They want to do their job well. They want acknowledgement for doing their job. It takes a certain personality type that will say, no, this is going on, and they'll offer pushback. And I was hired because I thought outside the box. I was hired because I was not one of those personality types. It was a salesperson. So that was exactly why I was hired. So it surprises me that a lot of people do not do this more. But hopefully more people will continue to do this because it would make the world a better place.
Yes, absolutely. Well, speaking of which, when we were preparing for this panel, we had a very interesting conversation about the value of whistleblowing to society. And I'd like for us to share some of that conversation with the audience, and starting with you, John. How would you frame the value of whistleblowers and whistleblowing to society generally, and what should we be doing to encourage it?
Right, that's a super question. In essence, if you start from the societal perspective, that wrongdoing, generally speaking, goes on behind closed doors. A lot of wrongdoing. If you want to have less wrongdoing, you need someone from behind those closed doors to come forward, expose what is happening behind those closed doors, and then it can be dealt with. The difficulty with this is that typically all of the costs of doing that fall on the whistleblower, and all the benefits are conferred on society. Now, if generally speaking, in my business anyway, following the money often will show incentives and motive and things, but I fully accept what Tom and Mia have said about whistleblowers maybe being slightly out of the mold. But if you look at the difference between the US system and the UK system with regards to whistleblowing, both at a societal level, we pretend that we want more whistleblowers, presumably for the reasons that I've just given. But in the United States, for certain whistleblowing activities, if there are fines, there are some mechanisms to reward the whistleblower financially. In the UK, there are some protections in law, very small, only through the employment tribunals, where you might be able to recover some very small sum, nothing really approaching your real career losses. And generally speaking, even if you were to be one of the tiny minority of whistleblowers who actually get a judgment in their favor, roughly 3%, then costs are the exception, not the rule. And the costs can be really genuinely hugely prohibitive. And in the UK, there is no financial incentive to be a whistleblower. It's an incredibly risky thing to do, not just for your health, wealth, career. You're done in that industry pretty much for the reasons that we previously discussed about blackballing. But they're very different approaches. And I would say that the US system, whilst it's not perfect by any means, and in fact, I think Mia would be able to give us better insight into that. but it still leads to better outcomes than the UK system. The UK system is one where the actual protections in law are incredibly small, because in reality, it just becomes a fight where the entity with the most resources win. If you're up against a very small firm and you happen to print lots of things out and what have you, you've got a chance. But if you're up against a well-resourced firm, then, I mean, my firms, the firm that I was employed by, have, as I said earlier, they claim to have 37 people working weekends on my case at some point. It's not about money, it's about crushing the whistleblower. Mia, what was your experience in this respect?
I would say that I agree with everything you said. I think the whistleblower carries a huge burden and has to make tremendous sacrifices. And some of these sacrifices you don't even know are going to happen. Like, I can't downplay how I had no idea that I was going to be blacklisted and have such a hard time, reinventing myself. If I could go back and do things differently, it would just be prepare myself better. And because you make a lot of mistakes along the way, just kind of like banging your head against the wall. You just keep doing, because you don't know why you're getting all of this rejection. And the other thing I think that would make it more effective, going forward, is if companies would actually put a number on what it's going to cost them. Like, Insys, there was a cost in their short-term profits. If they would have listened and they would have readjusted their strategies, maybe they wouldn't have made as much money in the short term. But now the company is bankrupt, careers, I don't know how many doctors have lost their licenses, the stockholders, how much money they lost. So there's a real cost to a company not listening and not taking steps. You can sweep things under the rug, but
not forever.
No, exactly. And the private sector, they're driven by numbers and by revenue, and they make their choices by revenue. How much money is this going to cost? So it would be very interesting to, and maybe Tom can explain a little bit more, Erika. There's a cost to not listening to the wrongdoing. There's a real impact. And I wonder, how much that plays in to their choices that they make.
Tom, do you have further thoughts about that? And by the way, I was, for some reason, there's a technical hiccup and I was dropped from the Zoom meeting. And in doing that, all of the questions have disappeared from my screen. There is one that I hope we can get to. And I noted the name of the person who asked it. But Tom, how about, do you have thoughts about Mia's observation?
Well, I do. I think they both touched on something. I mean, short-term making a killing, and I use that term literally in Mia's case. It is different from long-term sustainability of an organization. Unless, of course, you're a bank, which gets bailed out on a periodic basis, or an airline, or there are lots of, but in general terms, the frauds that are flagrant, that are causing massive harm, have a strong likelihood of hurting investors and people who work at the corporation and their customers in the long term. But in the short term, if the problem can be made to go away by a legal settlement with no admission of guilt or liability, then people can be very cynical, or C-suite people can be very cynical about how they're going to play this. I think it's time for us to take seriously, serious punishments for white-collar crime, which causes way more damage to our society than all the blue-collar crime put together. I mean, vastly more. Drug pushers versus fentanyl pushers. I mean, what's the difference here? I mean, help me with this. Except that, I don't think even folks who go to jail, and again, the Insys situation is a very, very outlier, exceptional case. I don't think they're getting the same treatment as the Sinaloa cartel. But yeah, it's a short-term and a long-term problem, and we need to decide which kind of a society we are. Are we a short-term financialized, gains for the 1% or the C-suite, or are we a longer-term building a sustainable economy? And I think we better be the latter, or we're in trouble.
I would agree. So one last question from me to John and Mia, and then Jim, there was a question from a fellow named Eric Sapp that was in the Q&A that I can no longer access. So I wonder whether you might be able to ask that question after I ask John and Mia another big question, which is, would you do it again? Considering everything that's happened to you and to your families and all you've gone through, would you do it again? John?
Okay. I would have to go through it again, simply because I did what I did because I was obliged to from a regulatory perspective. I would have been breaking the law if I didn't do some of the things that I was doing, and I could have lost my career. I'd rather follow the rules, do it properly. Yes. I mean, it's been miserable. There are things that I would do differently. For instance, I was very naive. I didn't print anything out. I literally got invited to a room and said, "You're fired." I'd made, double my annual budget in the first 4 months of the year, and so on. So I just did not see it coming at all. And I could have improved my chances of winning enormously by collecting the evidence and stuff. I mean, they denied that I even blew the whistle. To put this into perspective. And so that, there are lots of things that I would have done slightly differently, but in terms of doing what I actually did in terms of reporting the concerns of the wrongdoing, I mean, I'm an idiot, but yes.
Yeah. How about you, Mia? Would you do it over again? And then to Jim.
I would. I definitely would. My kids are so proud of it. It's something kids are so idealistic. They really believe in right or wrong, and they see things very cut and dry. And so I don't think they realize how it impacted their childhood so much financially. I luckily they have that naivete that children have, but they're super proud of it. And so at least it's my legacy, and I sleep with a clear conscience every day. So yes, I would definitely do it again.
Well, you're a great role model for your kids. So Jim, if you've retrieved that question, Eric Sapp's question for Tom.
Yeah, so the question was, Tom, you talk about commonalities of metaphoric playbook of retaliation, but do whistleblower experiences differ in any noticeable ways in the area of law or policy involved? For example, financial institutions versus national security. I went into it assuming that there would be a huge difference. And in fact, I found a huge commonality across public and private spheres, nonprofit and profit.
The playbook is the same. You identify and isolate the whistleblower so that they're walled off from infecting other employees with this same truth germ. You start building a paper trail to terminate them. So their performance reviews go from 5-star to 0 stars overnight. I mean, improbably overnight. Where possible, you do things like psychological fitness for duty examinations, call into question their mental stability, character assassinations in the press and in industry if necessary. Situations like Mia ran into where if you can destabilize them or intimidate them by private detectives, break-ins, threats, even violence, and then later blackballing. If you're in each industry has its own form. So if you're in national security, you deny someone security clearances so they can't do their job. But it's the same thing. It's blackballing, unemployability, render them unemployable and make them an object lesson for everyone else who's looking. Because you have 1% or 0.5% of people who are willing to be whistleblowers and 0.5% who are willing to be outright criminals. And then everyone else is sitting on this big fence and watching how it plays out. And so as the organization and run by the outright criminals, you want to make sure that everyone gets the message. This is you if you do. Strangely enough, at a university, at a nonprofit, a religious nonprofit, at the NSA, at a big bank, at a big pharmaceutical company, the same patterns of whistleblower retaliation play out again and again and again.
Tom, John, and Mia, thank you so much. We're out of time. I do want to mention that just in the past few minutes, there have been a lot of thanks directed to you three. You're so inspiring, and you really touch the audience. So thank you all, and thank you to the audience, to the attendees.
I want to thank all of you as well on behalf of Berkeley Law School. We really appreciate your time and your stories. We look forward to having people join us tomorrow for a continuation of this series, and then again on Monday. If you haven't already registered, you can do so at executive.law.berkeley.edu. And with that, wish you all the best. Thank you again.